Hi everyone, Mike here. Welcome to another episode of Merch Buzz. This is the career edition, and what I want to do today is I want to do two things. Number one, I want to motivate you because if you have received a job interview, and this is basically when an employer has decided they reviewed your documents, your cover letter, your resume, whatever else you've used to actually apply for the job. And at this point, they've reviewed it and they've decided to call you in for an interview. You have every reason to feel good and to feel motivated. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to tell you a couple of things just to make you think about certain things where you feel good about yourself. And then the second part of this episode, I want to take some time and actually go through basically step by step of what a typical interview looks like. And not just the typical, but the most common interviews. Now, if you're a student looking for an internship, a co-op, whatever you call it, if you're a new grad looking for your first job, or you're actually somebody who's been working for a number of years and you haven't looked for a job in a while, and now you're getting back into the workplace and the whole industry, and you just need a refresher. This is what I want you to listen to. And honestly, if you have to listen to this 10 times before your actual job interview, do it. Listen to it because it is going to help you. So let's start with the most basic information, and this is the motivational part. I really want you to hear this. If the employer has decided to call you in for an interview based on the information that you have submitted, they think that you can do the job. So I'm going to say that one more time because I really want you to hear it. If the employer has decided to call you in for an interview, they think that you can actually do the job. That is amazing. I hope that really sticks in your mind as you're actually going in, as you're in that interview room, and I want you to think about that whole thing throughout the whole process. Now, hopefully you were honest and truthful in your cover letter and your resume, and all the information basically that you provided is something that you can talk about without any problems. And depending on the stage of your career that you're in, at some point you're going to start looking at interviews basically as kind of a professional meeting where the other side, the interviewer, is guiding the conversation, but it's a two-sided conversation. Basically, you're just sharing your experience, you're talking about stories from your past, and there's nothing more to it. It just happens that they're asking you 7 to 10 or maybe 15 questions, right? But basically what you're doing is you're still talking about all the things that you mentioned on your cover letter and your resume. Okay, that's the first part of all of this. Now, let's go through what a typical, most common interview looks like. And if you've gone through a bunch of interviews and some of the stuff that I'm talking about is basic to you, stick with me because I'm doing this for a lot of different people. And as I'm talking about all this stuff, I have someone in mind, for example, who's going into their first real professional interview. So I'm going to talk about some of the basics, knowing that a lot of you guys that are listening to this actually know all this stuff, and that you would say, oh, this is common sense, right? But again, this is just a side note. I think the new rule is we don't say common sense anymore because what common sense is to one person might be completely new information to someone else. Anyways, let's get into it. So before I actually start going through, step 1, step 2 of the interview, the most important thing to keep in mind is that you want to go in completely comfortable. What do I mean by that? If it's 45 degrees outside, Celsius, I guess I have to be specific, and it's a hot day, but you kind of feel, oh, should I be wearing a full suit? Is it okay to just wear a suit, a shirt, and a tie? Yes, it is. You want to go in comfortable. You want to go in feeling really good physically, because anything that is taking away from what you are saying, anything that is taken away from your focus or what keeps you concentrated and on topic is a bad thing. It's a disadvantage to you. So most people that are interviewing you are very reasonable people. So you really have nothing to worry about when it comes to, are you wearing a jacket or not? Are you wearing a tie or not? If you look professional, you're okay. Going further on that topic, if you feel that when you're in other meetings or when you're meeting with your, let's say, group members, if you are a student, and once in a while, if you talk a lot, you need some water, bring a bottle of water. If you feel that somebody might be asking you a 2 or 3 or 4-point question, bring a notepad, bring a pen, take some notes. Don't write down the whole question, but again, make some points that will help or guide you through your answer, or keep track of those talking points that you need to keep in mind. For example, that you're going to be interviewed by 2 or 3 people. Bring 2 or 3 copies of your resume. Anything that you can do that will make you just slightly more comfortable, slightly more confident, do it. Okay, now all of that being said, let's go through the most common format, the most standard interview. When you go in to a company, let's say this is an on-site meeting, meaning that this is not happening somewhere at a university or somewhere else, some kind of an organization, but it's happening on company property. They say that the interview starts the second that you walk through the door, meaning that even the administrators, or using the the old school term, secretary, that's when your interview has already started. So being extremely polite and putting on that professional face on is extremely important, because a lot of managers, a lot of people that interview you will go back and ask the administrators, how was he? How was she? Was she polite? What exactly did they do when they came in through the door? All that kind of stuff. So that's all very important. And then let's say we get to the actual interview room. Even if there are, let's say, 3 people in the room, and one of them is sitting kind of to the back in the corner, and you feel like this is the person that's taking notes for whatever reason, it might seem strange to you, shake everybody's hand. Introduce yourself to absolutely everybody, because anybody who's in that room is important in that hiring process when it comes to that hiring decision. So you want to be extremely professional. Okay. So usually what the employers will do is they'll start it off and start with random questions that they really don't care about the answers. So, for example, they'll say, how is the weather? Is it hot out there? Is it cold? How was the drive in? Did you find the building okay? They don't care. What they're trying to do is they're going to give you about 30 seconds, minute, maybe 2 minutes to relax. But here's the trick. Most likely, you will be nervous. And statistically speaking, you're going to be nervous until you answer that first real question. So just keep that in mind. Basically, tell yourself, it's okay. I will be nervous. This shouldn't throw you off your game, because by the time you answer the first question, which is most likely somewhat insignificant, you're going to be able to collect your thoughts and actually be thinking about what you're saying and stick to those talking points that you've hopefully prepared for and studied for. Once you go through all that kind of like informal jargon, whatever you want to call it, they're going to start the real interview. And typically, or usually, it starts with, you know what, now that we've gone through the introductions, or maybe they've even spent a few minutes telling you about the company itself and the job itself, which you already should know about because you've studied the job description. They might say something like, why don't you tell us about yourself? Study this, practice this. If you don't, you're doing yourself a disservice, because this is one of the most common questions that you will be asked as an opener at the beginning of the interview. So you really want to study that and have some kind of a plan. And again, my advice is never go into an interview with a script, because if you go off script, you will not only be lost and confused, but again, you will be thrown off in general. But what you want to do is you want to have at least some talking points and have a natural flow to your conversation. So again, tell me about yourself. So what you want to do with this question is, it's important to know why you're there. It's important to know why you're in that interview. And the reason is, I guess there are two main reasons. First, I guess it would be answering the question, are you able to do this job? So basically, are you qualified? Do you actually have the technical understanding to do the job that is required? And then the second part, or the second question that the employer is asking is, can we work with you 8 hours a day? If the answer is yes to both of those, and you're a good fit, you're a perfect fit, you will get the job. So do you have the technical understanding, and does the personality match? Can they work with you 8 hours a day? If the answer is yes, you get the job. Okay, so moving past this, so basically what I'm trying to say is, when you're answering the question that is, tell me about yourself, you want to keep maybe, let's say, 20% of that answer somewhat personal. Everything else, you're trying to, again, answer that main question. And I'm going to be purposefully, or I guess on purpose, repetitive in this episode, because I really want you to think about certain things. Are you able to do the job? So basically what you want to do in that answer is talk about your history, talk about your passions that, again, relate to not only that job, not only that company, but the industry. And you want to tell the employer how all of that fits into not only your short-term goals, but your long-term goals. So let's say you're a student. Let's say you're a new grad and you've applied to 100 jobs. Maybe 150 jobs, and you get this one interview. Your job is to convince that company that they are the one and only employer for you. So that's kind of the approach that you should be taking. Okay, so let's say you've talked about yourself. There are a couple of different types of interview questions. I'm going to get a little nerdy and technical on you guys. There are direct questions, there are situational questions, there are behavioral questions. Direct questions and behavioral questions are extremely, extremely trendy right now. And I might spend a little more time talking about those and give you a few examples, because I really want you to pay attention to those. Once the employer has said, tell us about yourself, you go through your history, you talk about whatever you want to talk about, they might say something like, why don't you tell us why you applied to this company? Maybe you can go even further and tell us why you applied to this job specifically. Those are direct questions. So what I would say is, study not only your resume, study the job description. And then going further, study or learn or have information or examples on how your experience that's on your resume relates to the job description. So that would answer kind of like, why you applied to this job. And then the other thing that I would suggest you study or do a lot of research on is the company. And then relate, again, that to your own experience and your future plans, your career plans, and all that kind of stuff. Because, again, you don't want to just simply provide a very simple answer. You want to connect the dots, and you want to tell the employer how this fits into your whole plan. Because this is not a random application. This was a strategic application. This was thoughtful. And like I said earlier, they are your number one choice. They are the ones you want to work for. And then going further, let's throw out a few more direct questions. Don't be surprised, and I'm going with the most common questions, right? I'm actually bringing up the most common questions because they are asked very often. I don't want to give you a random question that's asked, one time out of 100. I want to actually talk about the questions that are asked more commonly. And those would be strengths and weaknesses. Some employers might say, what would you say your top 3 strengths are? Think about them. If the job description says, let's say the job description qualifications are asking for, and I'm going to come up with this, I'm going to be random here. If they're saying great communication skills, and let's say you're in engineering and you're looking for a design job, and they say excellent communication skills, AutoCAD experience, and time management. My suggestion is that your top 3 skills that they say, what are your top 3 strengths? You talk about something that is related to their needs. Trust me, it goes a long way. Okay, on the other side of that is the weakness question. Now, everybody hates this weakness question. Everybody knows that there's a trick to it, but you got to play the game. So what do? If a company, if the employer says, what would you say your biggest weakness is? Here's the rule. Here's a couple of rules, I guess. Do not give them a direct weakness because they will hear it, they will remember it, you will not get the job. So if you say something like, if they say, what's your biggest weakness? And you say, my biggest weakness is that I'm always late. Guess what they remember? Guess what they're going to write down as one of their notes? Always late. Nobody wants to hire somebody like that. So here's the trick, and this is where you play the game. You tell them what your weakness as identified is. And then the most important thing, so the employer doesn't want to hear about your weakness. They want to know that you've identified it, and then they want to know is what you're doing about it. Because again, it always comes back to you actually getting the job, being in the job, being in that situation, and then the approach that you're taking. So if something does happen at work, let's say you're lacking a skill or you identify that maybe you're not good at something, what would you do? So here's a quick little example. And again, I'll go back to, let's say you're a student. So let's say you're a student looking for an internship and the employer says, what is your biggest weakness? A simple example, and again, you should elaborate on this, is something like this. When I got into during my first year, all of this was very new to me, and I was really adjusting to life, so I had a hard time managing my time. I found myself working on a number of reports, working in a number of group projects. I joined a number of teams, and this was all happening at the same time when I had to study for exams. And it was really hard to manage time. So what I did was I came up with a simple solution. This would involve a simple daily to-do list, weekly to-do list, and a monthly to-do list. Done. It's very simple. So for example, you don't need to come up with this elaborate plan about what you did, because if you're at work and you're working and you have a daily and a weekly to-do list and it works, you're basically getting positive results. That's what the employer wants to hear. That is your weakness. The weakness was identified very quickly, but then you talked about how you've overcome that, or how you're managing that, or what you've done to kind of change and improve. Okay, that's it. Now let's move forward. I'm going to talk about situational questions very quickly because they're kind of, you can really come up with, I guess, answers on the spot, and there's no real strategic way to think about this because it really depends on the questions that the employers might be asking you. So the situational questions are kind of what they sound like, which is the employer gives you a situation and you tell them what you would do. Now I'm going to repeat that one more time because this is the difference between situational and behavioral questions. And as I said at the beginning, behavioral questions are extremely trendy, and I would really want you to spend a lot more time thinking and focusing on behavioral questions. But again, it's really important to recognize the difference. So situational questions, the employer gives you a situation and you tell them what you would do. Okay, so again, this is an example that I'm pretty sure won't relate to anybody listening to this, but I'm going to give it to you. The employer says something like, there is a fire in the building, what would you do? That's it. They give you a situation and then you tell them what you would do. So there's kind of like a bit of a free range, freestyle time frame that you can kind of like take and then, tell them your opinion, tell them what you actually would do. Again, that was an extreme example. So some of the more realistic ones would be something like, what would you do if you had a conflict with one of your coworkers? Or what would you do if you couldn't get all your work done on time? Something like that, right? So you basically tell them what you would do. In my opinion, that's fairly easy because you kind of, again, I'm going to use the same term. You want to play the game. You want to give the employer what you think they want to hear. Behavioral questions. And again, I on purpose, I'm not spending a lot of time on situational questions because they're not extremely common, and I feel that they're very easy to answer on the spot. This is the difference between situational and behavioral questions. Before I get into a couple of examples, I want to tell you about the reason that employers ask these questions. What's the method? Why are they so trendy, right? Take them seriously, and I'll tell you why. There are a number of companies that actually, when they set up interviews with people, in addition to, let's say, the time and the place of the interview, they send an info sheet and they say, part of your interview will be behavioral type questions, and we expect, keep that in mind, they expect you to answer those questions in this way. So there's an actual format. It's called the STAR method: situation, task, action, result. And we'll talk about that. So the companies actually expect you to answer those questions in that way. And if you're somebody, let's say like me, like I was maybe 10 years ago, and you say, why are you telling me how to answer a certain question? I'll just give you the answer that makes the most sense. If you think about it, the information that you're actually providing does make a lot of sense, and especially the flow of that information, which would be the situation that you were in, the action or the task that you took. Even if you're talking about a group project, the employer wants to hear about the action that you took, and then the result. My advice to you is, if you don't have a positive result, do not talk about that situation. Okay, so now let me kind of rewind a little bit. The theory behind behavioral questions is that the employer can predict what you will do in the future based on what you have done in the past. This is the extremely important part, what you have done in the past. So keep that in mind, and here's why. Behavioral questions are easy to identify for a simple reason. The employer wants to hear a specific example of what you have already done. And this is the difference between behavioral and situational questions. They don't care about what you would do. They're not interested. If you answer it in that way, if it's a bigger company and they're kind of rating or grading your answers, you will get a 0 because you're not answering their question. The question is, what have you done? So again, I said they're easy to identify, and this is why. Most behavioral questions start off with, tell us about a time, or tell me when, or tell us when. And here's the positive, or here's the good thing about behavioral questions. The employer can ask you 50 different questions, but they're usually on maybe 5 or 6 different categories. So what do I mean? If you think and you prepare during your preparation, if you think about 5 or 6 different situations that you were in, and I'll explain, then you'll be able to answer those 50 questions. So usually these questions are based on these categories: teamwork, time management, conflict resolution, and then, for example, if you're in a technical field or engineering or something like that, they might ask you about continuous improvement. And for example, since I'm talking about that one right now, a continuous improvement question might sound something like, tell us about a time when you suggested an idea to improve a process, maybe to save some money or to increase efficiency. If you come up with an example that kind of talks about something like that before you go in, there's no way that the employer can surprise you and throw you off, right? Now, going back to some of those different categories that I mentioned, you can do the same thing. Let's say they're talking about conflict resolution. If you come up with one situation where you're talking about a coworker or a group member you were having a hard time with, and there was some kind of a conflict, and you actually resolved it, that helps you answer that question. But not only that one question, they can ask it in many different ways. But again, you will be able to refer and to go back to that one situation and talk about it. Same thing goes for time management, right? Just think about when you had a number of things due around the same time. The employers are asking these questions specifically for the reason to see how you would deal with that if they were to hire you, right? But again, they don't want to know what you would do because, like I said earlier, those types of answers are easy to provide. They want to know exactly what you did because that's when you're going to open up, when they put you on the spot. That's when you're going to tell them the truth. And if you did fail or if you did something, for example, that they would consider not acceptable, if you don't prepare, chances are you will open up and make a mistake, right? So what you want to do is you want to come up with, like I said, 5 or 6 different situations, or think about them, that had a positive result, extremely positive result. And that goes a little further, because if you answer 5, 6, 10 questions and you have a positive result, you will leave a positive reaction or an emotional reaction with the interviewer that will make them feel good after you leave. So again, in general, when it comes to behavioral questions, think about 5 or 6 different situations that you're in that cover all those categories that I mentioned. Going further, I guess maybe let's do a little quick recap. So you've gone in, they've asked you about yourself, they've gone and asked you a bunch of direct questions, possibly directly from your resume, possibly strengths, weaknesses, why did you apply to this job? Why did you apply to this company? They go into maybe one or two situational questions. They go into behavioral questions. And then at the end, they might say something like this. Tell us why we should hire you over all the other candidates that we hire or that we interview today. Or they might say something like, is there anything else that you would like to add to this interview that we haven't discussed but you feel is important? Even though those two sound very different, they're pretty much exactly the same. They're asking the same information. And what you want to do is you want to definitely answer this, but you want to realize that you have about a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes to talk about all of your strengths, to talk about all the skills and qualifications that relate to that employer's needs. So there is a fine line, for example, in an interview where somebody's being confident and somebody is kind of borderline bragging, which is what you want to do, right? Because if you don't tell the employer how good you are, they won't know. But again, there's that fine line between bragging or talking about skills that you actually do have and being cocky. So you don't want to cross that line. So when it comes to those two questions, you want to tell the employer, and once again, my theory is repetition is good because they'll remember it. You want to tell them why you feel you're qualified. You want to go over all the specific skills. And again, go back to your resume, go back to your experience, and directly link it to the qualifications and the skills that the employer is looking for on that job description, right? There's a direct link. And then basically you can say something like, I do feel confident that I can do this job with little or no training, depending on your skill level, and leave them with that. Because this, at this point, is still the information that you control. So why not give the employer the most beneficial information to you, the most positive information that they can hear? Okay, let's go to the next stage of the interview. And that would be basically the employer saying something like, you know what? We've asked all the questions that we wanted to ask. Do you have any questions for us? In every single situation, in every single case, the answer should be yes. You do have questions for the employer. Now, let's go back. If you're a student, if you're looking for a 4-month internship, 12-month, 16-month, if you're a new grad, if you're somebody who's been in the industry for 5 or 10 years, you have questions for that employer. Because why would they commit to somebody who simply doesn't care or who simply is saying, you know what, I'll take it, whatever. Because you don't want to come off as impulsive. You want to come off as thoughtful, strategic. You want to know what you're getting into. This is a long-term decision. You want to be thoughtful, right? So I'll actually counter myself. I'll argue that comment. Let's say that you did have a few questions and they kind of answer them throughout the interview. So here's what you do. You actually say these words. So when they say, do you have any questions for us? You say, you know what? I actually did prepare 2 or 3 questions, but throughout the interview, you answered those questions, and I want to thank you. It is important for the employer to know that you had questions. Now, the rule when it comes to questions for the employer are simple. You don't ask for immediate feedback. So don't say, how did I do? Or, something like that. You'll be surprised. A lot of people actually ask that. You don't want to ask anything that will be considered selfish or self-serving. Nothing kind of like, how much do you pay, or when would my first pay increase be, or anything kind of like, in addition to the basic training for the job, what else would you provide? How much money would you provide, or give towards training for me, right? You can ask all those questions. There's always an appropriate time. You can negotiate a salary. You can talk about your vacation. You can talk about sick days. The interview is not the time. What you want to talk about is you want to talk about the job. You want to ask about the company. You want to ask about the team. So for example, you can say, can you tell me about the team, the people that I will be working with? Are they, and let's say you're a student, you can say, are they other students? Is it somebody who's been in the industry for 5, 10 years, right? Because there's a different skill level. There's a different style of training. There's a lot more information that you can learn from somebody who's been in the industry for 20 years than another student, if that's who you are, right? So those types of questions are extremely important. The most common question is, what are the day-to-day, or what does the day-to-day in this position look like? I would say stay away from that question, because most likely the employer has actually answered that in the opening if they've talked about the position, if they talked about the company. So you really want to kind of connect with that person, especially if they have the same education as you. Maybe they went to the same school as you. Maybe you want to say something like, you know what, I'm actually very interested. Part of my long-term goals is to become a manager like you. What did you do to actually get to that point? Now, all of a sudden, this person has the opportunity to educate you, to talk about themselves, and everybody likes to talk about themselves for whatever reason. So you're not only asking the right questions, but you're actually making that emotional or a connection based on personality with that person, and that's a benefit. So once you're done with all of that, again, always send them a follow-up, a thank you email. If you don't do it the same day or the next day, my advice is don't do it, but it should be very short, basically thanking them for the opportunity and always saying, if there's anything else, any more information that I can provide, please let me know. And that's it. Okay, so basically, again, I'm going to wrap it up the same way that I opened this, is by hopefully motivating you and saying that at this point, hear me, you're going into this interview, that's why you're listening to this. The employer thinks that you can do the job. Don't think at any point that, someone else is more qualified. You have no idea. You have no idea if the other person might be having a bad day, if they might be nervous, or whatever the case is. You might be way better than anybody else, but the important thing is that you are qualified. They think that you're qualified. There's no way that any employer is going to waste time. And then going further, everything that was discussed in the last 35, 40 minutes is basically what a typical, most standard interview looks like. So again, just listen to this every time you get an interview. Listen to it 10 times if you have to, and hopefully it helps you. But again, keep in mind, it's just people on the other side of it. I know there's a lot riding on this. These people are going to be paying you a lot of money to do the job, but trust me, they don't want to hire anybody who isn't a good fit, who isn't qualified. And again, you don't want to work for anybody who doesn't match your personality, or where you would have a pretty miserable time. Hopefully this was helpful. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if this is helpful. Let me know if there's any other specific information that you want me to talk about, and we'll go from there. Again, keep in mind, the employer thinks you're qualified. As of this moment, they think that you can do the job. Prove them right. Talk about what you've done. Talk about the information that's on your resume. Good luck, and hopefully I'll talk to you guys soon.